Good afternoon. I am Joyce Hunter, the Executive Director of ICIT, and welcome to our February 2023 virtual briefing. I would like to thank Menlo for their thought leadership in cybersecurity and sponsorship of this event. The Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology, ICIT, is the nation's leading cybersecurity think tank, providing objective, nonpartisan research, advisory, and education services to legislative, commercial, and public sector cybersecurity stakeholders. Our mission is to cultivate a cybersecurity renaissance that will improve the resiliency of our nation's 16 critical infrastructure sectors and defend our democratic institutions and empower future generations of cybersecurity leaders. Today's webinar is focused on 3 considerations for school systems when building their cybersecurity strategy. Schools educate our nation's future, so school administrators must navigate numerous challenges outside their control. With a reported 67 million malware attacks against education institutions during a typical 30-day stretch, one major challenge is that K-12 institutions are easy targets for cybersecurity attacks. These attacks have risen since the COVID-19 pandemic forced remote learning, and a few form of highly evasive adaptive threats called HEAT, H-E-A-T, using multi-vector attacks has arisen as a primary source of these offensives. Although most students are back in the classroom, the cyber attackers aren't slowing down their attempts to infiltrate the district networks. In this ICIT briefing, a panel of experts will discuss examples of recent attacks, opportunities to decrease vulnerability, and developing an attack plan and an action plan to maximize the district's resources. Our panelists are Dave Henchman, Acting Director for Information Technology and Cybersecurity for GAO, Michael Klein, Digital Infrastructure Fellow, Information Technology Agency, Department of Education, and Mark Guntrip, Senior Director, Cybersecurity Strategy for Menlo Security. Thank you, Marcella Denniston, for moderating. Marcella is a major contributor to the ICIT SLED chapter and an ICIT Fellow and a Senior Director for Security Assurance at Salesforce. Marcella, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And we have such an amazing panel here. I would love for each of our panelists to just give us maybe a little bit more on their background so the audience knows what your areas of expertise are. We'll start off with Dave Henchman.
Great, thanks, Marcel. Again, my name is Dave Henchman. I'm a director with the U.S. Government Accountability's Office, Information Technology and Cybersecurity team. I've been at GAO about 20 years now, and part of my portfolio is the cybersecurity of the nation's critical infrastructure sectors. And increasingly over the last several years, that work has focused on the challenges faced by both SLTT organizations as well as K-12 organizations and how they can better protect themselves against the people out there who wish ill on them. It's great to be here.
Thanks so much, David. Next, we have Michael Klein.
Hi, I'm Michael Klein. I'm the Digital Infrastructure Fellow at the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Educational Technology. I started in September there, and I head up our work on the Infrastructure Guide, which will include components related to cybersecurity to help folks in the field. And also I'm heading up a lot of the coordination in the interagency around K-12 cybersecurity. Before that, I started my career as a teacher. I taught 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade in Brooklyn and Harlem and New York City Department of Education, helped open a school on the US-Mexico border as part of the High Tech High Network, was a consultant supporting school districts around technology integration, and most recently was an IT director for a small school district in Connecticut before and during the COVID pandemic. I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks so much, Michael, for being here. Obviously, your expertise is going to come into play significantly with this conversation. And last but not least, Mark Guntrip.
Hi, Marcella, great to be here. So I'm Mark Guntrip. I'm as was mentioned, the Senior Director of Cybersecurity Strategy at Menlo Security. I've been in the cybersecurity field since before the word cybersecurity was a real thing, way back in the day. and I've been around from everything from engineering to product management, now the strategy side of things, helping figure out from the Menlo security perspective, what are the upcoming problems that our customers are likely to have, and how do we best address them to make sure that they remain as secure as they can be.
Thank you so much, Mark. So just want to go over some of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for this session. Obviously, we're talking about cybersecurity here in the K-12 education space. So some of the outcomes will be, we want to discuss the rise in attacks and reasons the school districts are being targeted, have some discussions around the highly evasive and adaptive threats and implications to the students in the schools. And then last, some recommendations for actions to mitigate the risks and vulnerabilities associated with these attacks. And with that, we're going to get right into the questions here. So this first question, I want to direct it towards Dave. Let's set the groundwork. We can safely assume that cyber attacks exploded during the pandemic, but are we continuing to see increasing attacks towards schools?
Absolutely, and unfortunately, yes, very much so. When the pandemic first hit, the nation's schools basically physically shut down and moved to online learning. And so you had the sudden explosion of both attack surfaces in terms of expanded school networks and the devices that kids were using to dial in and get online. And some of these networks might not have been all that secure in the first place. And so I think they provided a lot of targets of opportunity for bad actors. From an auditor's perspective in the work we've done, there isn't what we would call solid data to support exactly how bad these attacks become. We see in the news a lot, we hear stories, and different firms do different studies, and it's just to know that the numbers are increasing without doubt. And I think part of the challenge is not every organization wants to readily admit that they've been attacked, because that could either, highlight themselves for further attack or just the embarrassment of it. But I think that, when you look at the data that are available and the folks that we've talked to both at the SLTT level and the K-12, we know that these attacks are perpetrated by both nation actors and criminal groups, but then ranging all the way down to students who wake up one morning, have access to the dark web, and decide they don't want to take a test that they didn't study for. So there's a lot going on out there, and it's increasing.
That's a really interesting perspective, because I hadn't actually thought about the concept of insider threats of students actually being a part of that as well. Michael, do you want to expand on that a little?
Yeah, I would say I agree 100% with Dave's assessment, and would just build on it by saying that I think the predominant threat that we're seeing right now is ransomware attacks. It is again, mentioned like Dave, a target of opportunity. We have ransomware as a service organizations, no longer just nation state actors and advanced persistent threats who are engaging in this kind of activity. And so every day or couple of days, we're seeing school districts that are either having to close, some having to extend their school year, others choosing to pay the ransom. And so there are a lot of choices and a lot of challenges that come to executive leadership around this question of managing cyber risk in the environment today.
Thanks so much, Michael. And we do hear a lot about the threat of ransomware. But Mark, can you talk a little bit about other types of attacks that school administrators should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think ransomware probably quite rightly gets the lion's share of the headlines, just because of the impact to operations, because of the sums of money that we're talking about when it comes to that. So that's normally the one that kind of takes top billing, as it were. But as you look at the threats that are coming through, and Joyce mentioned at the beginning of this about the highly evasive adaptive threats or heat threats coming in, a lot of what we're seeing is, and again, going down to what Michael said about ransomware as a service, rather than all of this being one massive threat that's coming through, it's being broken down into all the different stages of how do I get in, and once I'm in, what do I do? And so what we're seeing from a heat attack perspective is the threat actors out there actually understanding, for the large part, exactly what technology school districts are likely to have, and then they work their threats around that so that they get that initial access, they get that foothold into the organization. And I think that's something that when you're in security, when you're looking at what bad is going on my network, what do I need to do, how do I stop this, that's not necessarily something that you would notice, because nothing bad happens if just I have a connection in and I don't do anything with it. And I think that's where the disconnect can come in, that it isn't just this ball rolling down the hill and it gets faster and faster and faster. It's I'm going to get a connection, then I'm going to wait. I'll sell it, I'll use it at a later date, and it could be ransomware, it could be credential phishing, it could be lateral movement. There's a whole host of things that could be put in there depending on what the motives are of the threat actor coming in, and especially with all the sensitive data that schools and school districts hold around not only the students but parents and teachers and everything else. It's actually a treasure trove of information that they could look to extract from that organization.
It sounds like between the threats that we're seeing inside of the school system from the students, and then also external to that with advanced persistent threats and ransomware as a service, the schools have a lot of work to do in that area, especially with the rapid shift towards virtual learning, right? So Michael, who are the primary targets of these attacks within the school systems for ransomware and the other cyber attacks we're discussing?
Sure. I wish there were an easy answer to that other than everyone, but I'll kind of flesh that out a little bit, right? So I think that the challenge is, so you have a couple different kinds of attacks, right? So for things like business email compromise, we're really looking at an attempt to extort or extract money from the school district by phishing or whaling, right? Getting a phishing attempt to someone who is at an executive level and being able to take money out of the school system, right? So that's one attack, and that's targeted more towards the finance office or more towards the superintendent. But then for things like ransomware, you're looking at, attack vectors could be through phishing. You're looking to get initial access and then escalate privileges and then move laterally and then get to kind of the domain controller to be able to push out the ransomware and be able to lock down all the systems. That can be done through phishing, which could be anybody, but especially privileged accounts, right? So folks who work in IT, folks who have escalated privileges, as well as looking at vulnerabilities and patching, right? And we'll get to this in a little bit, but I think that really working from lists of known exploited vulnerabilities. All people are doing is going online. It's like going to Google. You just go to Shodan, type in a vulnerability you're looking for, and you can see all the systems that currently have that vulnerability touching the internet. And that's how we see a lot of people getting access as well, right? So it's either through unpatched vulnerabilities, through phishing, or through other ways to compromise, potentially not having multi-factor turned on their accounts.
Thanks, Michael. So, Mark, you work in the security, the product security space, in that Menlo provides products. What would you say are some of the protections that are currently put into place based on these targets that Michael just described?
Yeah, so I think you can choose your poison when it comes to what it is you want to do. There's so many different solutions out there, especially when you just type in the word ransomware. Everybody's got a solution in some way, shape, or form. I guess that goes to show how big the problem is, that everybody wants to be associated with it. And so I think it really comes down to the school district, to the individual, to the security team, to figure out what their goals are, who they want to protect. Is it the students? Is it the faculty? Because there'll be different levels of acceptance of security layers being put in there from one group to the other. Then to look at what type of technology. Are we looking at something that's going to be detection based? And I think we hear a lot about whether it's EDR on the endpoint or XDR for pulling all our detection and response pieces together, MDR if it's managed. So there's lots of focus on detection and response, which is needed. It's required for just about everything that Michael said in there around lateral movement and everything else. But I think we also need to kind of think maybe one step forward of if everything's detection and response, do I have enough time to be able to respond to everything that it detects? I would guess the answer is probably no. And so how do I start to maybe prevent more of these threats coming in, whether that's through, again, from the Menlo perspective, looking at isolation technology to stop those coming in, whether it's network segmentation, whether it's deception technology to actually hide what you've got and where it is. I think there's many different ways that you can look to improve your security, but doing it in a way where it doesn't put more of a burden on the humans to then actually go and fix and resolve and actually make potentially even more work if the alerts just start rolling.
If I could build on what Mark was saying, I think one piece of context that would be helpful for folks that might not be familiar with this. In our country, we have about 14,000 school districts, and all of those districts have local control of how they run their institutions. And about 70% of those have 2,500 students or fewer, and maybe have 1 or 2 people on the IT staff that are doing all of the work of ensuring that the district is running. They may also be the principal or the band teacher. It's not always an individual who has that as their full-time job. And so I think the thing I want to keep kind of hammering home for folks is that when we're thinking about these things, I would kind of point to have a plan for what happens in the event of ransomware, exercise that plan, get everybody in a room and just walk through who do we call, how do we make sure this is working, and then pick 1 or 2 key things that you can do, drawing on things like CISA's cybersecurity performance goals, including implementing multi-factor at the highest level types of accounts. You're not going to necessarily put it on every student account right away, but figure out what are those high leverage moves that you can make with the limited resources that you have.
Thanks, Michael. And I think you pointed out something that's really important, and that's the IT administrators at the schools, right? A lot of times they're pulling a double duty. It's not their primary job. And the way that I always like to describe it is that an IT administrator isn't necessarily a security person either, right? It's the equivalent of, say, the difference between saying I'm a doctor and I'm a heart surgeon, where a security person has a very specific type of role, where an IT administrator may be a little bit broader. And it's not to say that they don't know how to implement security features, but that's not really their primary function either, right? So thank you for expanding on that. Dave, building on the ransomware question, other than monetary, what are other ways these ransomware attacks impact schools?
So in the last couple of years, GAO has done 3 reports related to this. We did 2 looking at federal assistance to K through 12 organizations on the cybersecurity side, as well as a study at the impact of ransomware on SLTT organizations. And I think it will come as no great surprise that there are a multitude of other impacts that are not monetary. In addition to the public reports that we see, K through 12 organizations shared with us, what they heard about attacks, what they've gone through as attacks, and the themes are all very, very similar. These attacks result in networks shutting down for days to maybe even weeks, sometimes with additional weeks to months of recovery time, depending on how you end up resolving the incident. And I think you also hear about the loss of both employee and student data. And so now you have student data, some of the most vulnerable members of society, with their information either having been seized, being held for money, or released in some cases. And so I think that, when you look at all these different types of impacts, especially the student data disclosure, that can also lead to loss of confidence in the district or institution. And, that's in addition to whatever external pressure is going to come to bear from the higher ups, because now they want this problem fixed or the vulnerability fixed. And I think it just creates that much more of a morass beyond just the ransomware issue.
Thanks, Dave. That's such a significant impact as well, because I think when we put that much pressure on the schools, it makes it very difficult for them to also want to share that information out, right? And typically in cybersecurity, the more information we could share across the sector, the better chance we have at preventing future attacks.
Yeah, definitely.
Mark, what should districts do when they are a victim of an attack? What types of planning should be done to prepare the district leadership when an attack happens?
Yeah, I think the planning is key to all of this, and Michael already touched on this. I think if you're the victim of a cyber attack, let's use ransomware as the example, as the topic of this, that if you don't have a plan when that happens, then you're in trouble, because every decision that you have to make, you're not only up against time of when does this expire, when do you erase my data, make it public, whatever the penalty might be for non-payment. You have everybody with different opinions coming in, and everyone has a great idea or an option or something, and you've got to make a decision. So I think key coming into this is to plan ahead of time. We know that school districts don't necessarily have dedicated security personnel. They might not. And so getting ahead of this and going, well, you know, when I've got some downtime, maybe during summer vacations, we're actually going to plan this thing out and maybe start off with the most important question when it comes to ransomware: are we going to pay it or are we not? Because making that decision with a clear head, with a room full of the right people to make that decision, is way easier than doing it when you've got 17 hours before this data goes public. And then the second question is, well, how much can we afford to pay? Like, what's the level that we can go to? Because we see a lot from the Menlo Security side that there's actually a lot of bargaining and negotiation that can go into this. That just if a threat actor says $1 million, I'll make up the number, you can actually bring that down. They'll aim high, but they'll take something a whole lot lower. So kind of knowing where you want to get to is actually key as well. But with the ransom piece taken out of it, it's a lot around communication. In fact, I would say it's almost all around communication. Who do I tell? What do I tell them? How much do I have to tell them? When do I have to tell them? What do I have to do for any public disclosures that say I have to tell certain people that I've been breached, or ransomware, everything else? But it's doing all of that ahead of time. And then, exactly as Michael said, don't just have a plan, run through the plan, go through it, do a tabletop exercise. Let's assume that we've been breached, assume this data was stolen, this is what they're asking for. What do you do? You've got 20 hours, tell me what the plan is, and then let's make sure it all works, so that if it does come all the way down to, do we have backups? Can we restore them? How long does that take? Exactly to Dave's point, is that 1 day? Is it 1 week? Is it 3 hours? How much downtime are we likely to take? And then that might impact, are we going to pay it or are we not? But it really is all about getting everybody agreed before the event, rather than scrambling and trying to figure it out when you're sinking in the quicksand, as it were.
Thanks, Mark. And actually, just to go off of that question a little bit, Dave, are there stipulations on paying ransoms by the school districts, just based off of the fact that they are, public sector? Are they permitted to even pay these ransoms as a school district if they chose to take that approach?
That is something that changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but I think it's a really important question. States are starting to put into place mandatory disclosure laws, which I think is, the communication piece that you mentioned. How can we know there's a threat if we're not communicating that there's a threat? And so I think that's a good first step. But in terms of actually paying that, it's really up to local jurisdictions about whether they do that, or whether there are any prevention, or whether there's anything in place that prevents them from doing that.
And that's probably a really significant part of the preparing process for each school district, I would say, right? Michael, you talked about the tabletop exercises. Who needs to participate in those tabletop exercises from the school district?
Oh, thank you so much for this question. This is my favorite question. So I want to build on what Mark said and what Dave just said. So I think the tabletop exercise is an amazing opportunity, and probably the best use of 60 or 90 minutes that you as a leadership team can have in addressing cyber risk. I think ideally the people who would be at the table are at least executive leadership, like the superintendent, definitely folks from the IT team. If you have communications folks, they should be there as well. Operations, because it could shut down things like your HVAC system, finance office, because you want to make payroll. So there are implications that flow through all of these different pieces. And so the more of those executive leaders you have at the table, the better. And ideally school board members as well, because they're a key part of governance in our country around school districts. And so helping them understand the challenges. If you have someone who might be legal counsel, most districts don't, but if you have someone that you hire to support around legal, that's a great person to have in the room as well. And then another opportunity is a great place to meet with your CISA cybersecurity advisor. There's one in every state in the country. And so that person having them at the table, or at least on speed dial, is helpful. And then FBI also has folks there as well that can help out with this. So really making those connections of walking through this process together. And then the other thing I wanted to build on here is, to Mark's earlier point, I think that when you're the victim of an attack, it's very challenging to know what to do in that moment. And just the simple thing of having the plan and printing it out and having a phone tree. because you may not have access to any of your systems and you'll need a way to communicate with people. And so even just having those very basic steps is important, which might not be a part of your regular incident response plan, but would certainly be part of a ransomware response plan.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, we're all technologists here, but there's nothing that's going to combat having good old piece of paper and pen with information on it when your systems go down, right? Thanks so much, Michael. And actually, this next question is for you as well, Michael. CISA just released the K through 12 school security guidance. Do you anticipate school administrators prioritizing cybersecurity based off of that?
You know, I do. I think that there's a growing understanding among school-based administrators, among district leaders, that cybersecurity is a key risk management component of running a district. And I think that it's kind of raising up now to the same level as financial risk, right? This is not a decision that's just living with a CTO or an IT director anymore. This is something that really has to do with the ability to communicate what you're doing with the community. And so that really has to live at the level of the administrators who have those closest relationships with families and with students. So I think there really is a growing understanding of this. I think, you know, institutions within education like the superintendents associations and the principals associations are engaged in these conversations, as well as the more specific entities like COSIN, which is our organization that really focuses on IT directors and engages with superintendents as well. So you have lots of great communities engaging in these conversations, and hopefully, kind of as Dave and Mark were pointing out before, more folks willing to reach out and have conversations about the challenges they've been facing, about the breaches that they've experienced. And I think that one of the things that the report will really do in helping move that conversation forward is focusing people on a few really high leverage things that they can do in their district, and then looking at a way to track themselves over time on those cybersecurity performance goals, right? Because if you don't measure it, it's really hard to know if you're making progress. And so the fact that we now have kind of CISA's version of, in critical infrastructure, here are the topics you need to be thinking about, here are the specific steps you can take, we can start to have more of a common understanding across our 14,000 districts in 50 states and all of our tribal and other entities as well.
Thanks, Michael. CISA actually provides an assessment tool to evaluate physical security for the schools. Mark, are there any assessment tools for the digital security space that school districts can lean into?
Yes, absolutely. And actually from CISA, they actually offer cyber assessments as well, so risk and vulnerability assessments that they can actually carry out. So I think very much as we look at how we figure out what we have and what we need to do, the digital world is something that arguably even more so than the physical world now is potentially at risk or vulnerable to attack. And so as we look at the assessments, whether it's through CISA, whether it's through a different vendor that a school district might choose, it's very much about figuring out what my vulnerability is and how do I visualize that. So whether that's, I'll take a step back. Normally you'd use a security framework for that. So CISA, I think, uses MITRE, I believe, as their security framework of choice, but it might be NIST, it could be some other one that an organization might choose to really say or to show how an attack could and might get through the resources that are in there, looking at vulnerabilities that are inherent in the systems that are in place and where the biggest gaps might be, and then be able to guide the security teams, the school districts to say, well, this is where you need to go first. And I think that's really the key thing to come out of all the assessments. If honestly, if you've never failed an assessment, you've never taken an assessment. There's going to be something that's in there, and it's a case of prioritization. Where do I go first? Where am I most secure? And maybe I can leave that to last, and then you can have your plan of attack to make yourself better, because the aim is always to get better. You're never going to be good enough. You've always got to keep getting better.
Yeah, if
Thanks,
I could
Mark.
add one last thing to that, I would say that CISA's cybersecurity performance goals that they just put out crosswalk with the NIST framework that Mark was talking about, as well as the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And it gives a much more narrowed list for people to focus on now, which will be incredibly helpful. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention MSISAC, which is the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is an organization that any school district in the country, as well as state agency, can join for free, that provides updates on cybersecurity alerts, will help with some elements around vulnerability assessment, and provides a lot of great free and low-cost resources. And as an IT director for myself, was one of the main places I went to help understand the challenge and also to build community. Because I think that's the other piece of this, is that you're not alone. Even though there are 14,000 districts, each state usually has an organization that helps to organize around that. And these information sharing communities are vital, not just in the education sector, but across critical infrastructure sectors in helping to build that resilience together.
That's a great point, Michael. And we've talked a lot about what schools can do voluntarily up until now. But we also have the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and that has some stipulations regarding cybersecurity and accountability for educational information. Dave, are we seeing attackers target this type of information?
Yeah, unfortunately it is. And I feel like it's almost a conscious thought on the part of these bad actors to target student information, whether it's more likely to score a payday because of the sensitivity, whether it's attention that they can get, right? And what better advertisement than a successful attack that hits the news? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the impact about a successful attack and the ripple effect that can have in terms of confidence in the district. Hey, I'm a parent. Is my student's information really safe in this online environment? Is this what I really want to be doing? And I think that all just creates a big mess, and it's unfortunate. And I bet Michael has a perspective from the education side as well.
Yeah, I think that, and this kind of speaks to what Dave said and also what Marcus previously said, which is a lot of the initial points of access are the same regardless of the outcome that they're shooting for. So whether it's ransomware and preventing availability of the system, whether it's integrity and destroying the data that was on the system or changing it, or whether it's an issue of confidentiality, that you're trying to get that information and then release it in such a way that harms the people who it's being released about, those all often have the same initial points of entry. And so from a defender's perspective, a lot of the things you can implement in terms of mitigations will help across all of those different pieces. In education, FERPA is kind of our one federal law around data privacy, which touches mostly on the confidentiality piece that we just talked about. However, critical infrastructure is mostly about integrity and availability, right? If I can lock down a school district and stop them from doing anything or wipe their systems, then I'm going to be able to exact more money from them or have a greater impact on the system. And I think that that's a challenge we face because there are really no federal laws around that kind of across the federal interagency and in education as well.
And Michael, what constitutes educational information under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act?
Great question. This is the place where I say I am not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. And I would definitely defer to our Student Privacy Policy Office, which is the entity within the federal government that does this. But what I can say is that it's about education records, and that those records are and there are a number of exemptions to those records as well. But that can include a lot of personally identifiable information that has to do with a student up through and including their transcripts and any number of other kinds of information that are stored by the school district or by vendors that the school district has engaged with to support that work. And I can point you to some resources to kind of define those pieces too, but I don't want to step on any legal landmines that I don't quite understand.
Not a problem. Thanks, Michael. And actually, this is a very interesting piece because that information, so student information, and just me as a parent, I know this information and having worked in cybersecurity, children's information is much more valuable on the dark web because their identities can be easily stolen and utilized for personal credit, right? Because nobody's monitoring a child's credit score. And so having that information, their name, date of birth, address, those are all components that you can utilize to open up a line of credit. And we see this a lot on the dark web where children's information gets sold because it goes under, it goes under wrap for quite a long time until they turn 18 and then understand that, they have all of this debt or they've been in bankruptcy because of the fact that somebody stole their information when they were younger. So such an important and crucial piece, I think, to protect that educational information. Thank you, Michael.
And to build on that, to build on that piece one step further that I think is unfortunate, the attackers, as we're seeing, are starting to leverage that even more. So just recently, there was an incident in the UK where specifically information about students and their behavior and their special education status was being kind of leveraged as a ransom tool. And so not just this data broadly for the points that you're talking about around kind of monetary exploitation around credit, but also the targeting of our most vulnerable students and their data as a way to force payment from the schools that are being attacked.
So many different aspects to that information. I think we sometimes don't realize how valuable these small components of data are when we put them all together. Thanks so much. One of the major pressing concerns for school districts is budget. Do you have any recommendations, Dave, for positioning or justifying increasing cyber budget?
So this is a hard question. When we go out and we're talking to K-12 or small SLT organizations, this is a hard question that everyone faces. Historically, cyber almost seems to be an afterthought, until something bad happens. And we've talked today about, scarce resources. One person is responsible for IT for a district, and that includes cyber. And maybe that's not the priority because they're just trying to make sure that the connections stay up for kids to be able to get online. And so then, something bad happens, then you have to shore up your defenses and maybe also fix something that was broken in the attack. And so you're probably competing against a lot of other priorities for these scarce resources. But, I think we've made a couple points today that CISA's recent guidance, that the idea of cybersecurity is gaining prominence and, being thought of along, I think the analogy that is being thought of along the same scale as financial risk, I think is also happening. It's a slow road, but I think it'll get there. So, there's no magic answer for how to get an increased cyber budget. I think, and this will probably sound a little bit trite, but I think it's important, and it's something we've heard consistently when we go out and talk to people, is that it's important to be intentional about the resources that you're requesting. It's easy to say, cyber, I need this, but people don't get that. But if you can really sit down and think about making a case to what I'll call a layperson, someone who isn't maybe as technically savvy, I think that creates a stronger chance of success for having a successful request. And I think it's also important that you understand why you're making a request as well, so that if you do get questions, you have good answers. I think it's also important to leverage the free and discounted services out there. Michael mentioned MSISAC. They have so much stuff that's available for people, and that a lot of organizations we've talked to weren't aware of. So I think there are a lot of resources there. And finally, I wouldn't rule out the idea of getting access to some of the cyber grants that are out there. We're doing a job right now, a report that will come out later this year, sort of surveying the landscape of cyber grants across the federal government. And then obviously there's also FEMA's new $1 billion cyber grant program, the first awards that are being made, and we'll be doing an audit of that program as well. That report will be issued towards the end of 2024.
Thanks, Dave.
I think to add on to what Dave said, I think he hit something really important, and I would just use a slightly different word, is that when you're the technical person talking to the business person, you've got to make that translation. It's like we need to Google Translate from bits and bytes to dollars and cents or trust, or kind of whatever the right metric might be on the other side, so that they understand what it is you're asking, or not what you're asking for, but why you're asking for it, and what the hopefully positive ramifications of spending X amount of dollars on that will be. Because if it makes sense to them, they're more likely to agree, rather than I need something that sounds really complicated and I don't know what it is, but sure, I guess. You're right. So I think you have more chance of success if you talk in their language.
I think building on what Mark just said, I would just add that when I think about my successes in working with my superintendent and in talking with superintendents about these kinds of topics, really being able to speak to people about the impact on teaching and learning, and about continued operations, and also the financial impacts. And so being able to speak to the things that an executive leader is thinking about every day, And also, like you said, the trust of the community, the trust of the school board, and the trust of the families that you're serving, and the reputational harms that could come from these things. And so I think there really are a few ways that we can make that translation. But as Mark said, sometimes I get up there and I look like the person who's drawn the string connections between everything, and I'm super excited about it, but I really should just be trying to explain in a basic way, here are the challenges that you're going to face, and here's what it means for the superintendent.
Thanks, Michael. Dave, this question is for you. Many states are proposing a whole of state approach to cybersecurity to maximize resources. What are your thoughts on this approach and ensuring the district's needs are prioritized?
So in talking to folks, I can say that not everyone is crazy about this approach. I think that is one of the big reservations that people have about the new FEMA program, because awards are only being made at the state level. And I think further, when you break it down $1 billion over 4 years, divided among 50 states, on average, it's something like $5 million a state per year, which doesn't go very far. And so then you're immediately in the scarce resources, argument. And what does a small little district and maybe a less developed part of a state, how do they make the connection at the state level so that their equities are being represented and that they are making their, they get a even consideration for their priorities? So I think that's a challenge, and it really depends on how, and this will vary from state to state also, how the state is approaching this. Are they really sort of looking at, okay, here are the state priorities because of the state agencies and state services, or are they looking a little more sort of whole of state across everyone and having the chance to get down and engage at the local level and understand what those needs might be and whether that has to be a consideration in the prioritization process? And again, it's hard because even, often at states, the resources are scarce also. And so it's, what are those priorities? And what do, if I'm at the state level, what do I need to focus on? And what are my mandates for what I need to better secure with this money that I've been given? And it's a challenge, I think.
Yeah, to build on what Dave's saying, I think one of the most important things I've learned in the few months that I've been in federal policy work is that there are so many conversations about authorities, or like, what are we allowed to do? And then what's the proper role of what we could do? And I think those flow down too. So we see that at the state level, and we see that in districts as well. And so to the extent that districts can help work with states to have that whole of state approach, even if it's just, this is the framework we're going to use in our state around cybersecurity, or this is the place where we're going to convene to discuss cybersecurity across our districts, including the state agency. Those kinds of things are so incredibly helpful because it's really building that connective tissue and helping people know how to contact each other and help each other out, even when resources are scarce.
So Michael, based off of that, where would you recommend district administrators start planning their cybersecurity strategy?
Sure. This is like setting up for the fastball. I love this. So if I were king of the world, no, I'm just kidding. I think the kinds of things that we see as being most effective are when district administrators start with the executive leadership team and thinking about what their goals are and what are the challenges that they're facing, right? And I think in really concrete terms, what that looks like is, do we have an incident response plan? And let's just walk through what would happen if we had a ransomware attack. And there are great resources from CISA and from the Department of Education that already have those tabletop exercises listed out, where you can just walk through together, who am I contacting? What happens next? How are we communicating with the press if they call? What's going to happen step by step through this process? Because I think that gives people a feeling of, I can control this, I can work on this, and I can see the pieces that we might not have in place yet that we could improve. And then I think the other things are really pointing back to what CISA talks about, right? If you can only do a few things, put multi-factor authentication on every account of someone who has privileged access to a system. Even better if you can do it for everyone, but that's very overwhelming for most districts. So just start with your IT folks, your executive leaders, and anyone who has that privileged access. Then ensure that you've scanned for those known exploited vulnerabilities. And CISA has a great catalog, the KEV catalog, that details all of those known exploited vulnerabilities and helps to think through how to fix those problems. And then finally, even something as basic as basic user training around phishing and around just general awareness, because things can get in from anywhere, from students, from teachers, from other people like that. And once they're in the environment, they can build with that trusted relationship, right? And so that's where kind of the folks on the front lines are our best defense. And so really investing in helping them understand the challenges at a high enough level that it doesn't feel overwhelming for them, but giving them one or two things they can do to actually help, right? Because I think that within my district was one of the biggest challenges was, what are we going to do to ask secretaries and students and teachers one or two things that they can actually implement meaningfully in their day-to-day practice.
Thanks, Michael.
I think that one thing I'd add to that, as you start to look at a strategy for either a school or a school district or beyond, is that everybody's going to be starting from a different point. And so I think that kind of way, that there is no one size fits all. If you do 1, 2, 3, 4, the bell rings and we can all, all cheer. You really have to understand where you are, what you've got, what budget you have, what resources you have, and then go into everything Michael said. So based on that, what are our goals? What are our plans? What are we looking at? What are we trying to avoid? What are we trying to minimize? And what are we asking each group to do to go from your own starting point to your own finish point? There isn't a kind of this isn't a marathon where everyone starts at the same point and finishes at the same point. Some people might get 3 steps in and go, actually, that's success. I did everything I needed to do.
Thanks, Mark. So to wrap up our session here, what I'd like to ask each of the panelists is, what are your 3 considerations for school systems to keep in mind when developing their cybersecurity strategy? Dave, let's start with you.
So I'm going to sound like a broken record, and hopefully I'm not going to steal Michael and Mark's thunder. But I think the first thing is take advantage of the free and discounted resources that are available out there. There's a lot more than you think, and that's both at the MSISAC as well as the federal level. Train your people. We talked about that. Make them, help them recognize phishing attacks. Have a response plan. Practice it. And then the third thing is go back and practice your response plan again.
Thank you. And Mark?
So I have some of the same stuff in here. So if I were to choose 3 things, I would say it comes back to that planning thing. Or you know what? Maybe I would go with the same way you get to Carnegie Hall is practice, practice, practice. The best thing you can do is plan, plan, plan. Maybe that might be the way to do this. But really plan ahead of time, as I mentioned back at the beginning. Figure out what your biggest risks are from where your starting point is. And then to exactly what Michael said to the previous question, figure out what your future plans are and your goals so you know in what direction you're heading. I think the second thing I would choose is your security framework, so you can actually visualize what it is you're doing, how you're making progress in the right direction, and albeit, well, MITRE is definitely very complicated. You can look at the green, yellow, reds and actually show to a non-technical person how things are starting to become more green, and therefore we are more secure and less likely to suffer from a threat coming in. And I think the third thing, which is again something I mentioned earlier, is resource planning. Figure out what you have and what you can do with it. And it could be something as simple as, there's a tool, a security thing that I want to put in. How much time will it take me to manage it? How much time will it take me to operate it? Because just because it can do something, it doesn't mean that I have the resources to be able to make it do that. And then sign up for as much as your staff to take on, and don't kill yourself trying to do everything with very limited resources. And that could be, or the answer to that, I guess, could be how do I do something a little differently? So that rather than going back to what I mentioned before around the detection technologies, where you get a lot of alerts and a lot of human work that is therefore now required, additional human work, maybe we start to think about how can I either automate things or how can I reduce those alerts and pull back to something that's going to prevent the threats. That if you don't even need to tell me about it. If you fixed it, it's all good. You just keep going. You stopped it before it came in, so that I can remove the level of work from my team, from my resources, rather than adding to it in the goal of security. But we're becoming more secure, but we're actually even having to do more work with a small team.
All right. And I believe, oh, there we go. Michael came back on there. Michael,
Sorry about
so
that.
that final question to you as well. I know you already talked quite a bit about the cyber strategy, but what are the 3 top
Yeah,
considerations you see for school systems to keep in mind?
sure thing. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. So let me just pull out, like a nerd, read the CISA K-12 Cybersecurity Act report, super important. And as outlined in the CISA K-12 Cybersecurity Act report, because I am a CISA fanboy, make sure that you are doing the highest leverage things that you can, which include implementing multi-factor and really looking at their cybersecurity performance goals, because that, to Mark's point, does provide you with a roadmap of some basic steps that you can take and improve your security over time and show that growth. Number 2, elevating this to the level of executive leadership. So this is a conversation that should be happening at the executive leadership table with the school board. And the best way to do that is to do a tabletop exercise and talk about how you might respond to these things, because it's not a question of if, but when for most school districts. And finally, really take advantage of those low and no cost resources, including joining MSISAC and other K-12 focused organizations that do information sharing, like K-12-6, that do a great job, and we're called out in the report here for really making that connection between districts to help them learn from each other's challenges. And related to those connections, know exactly who you're going to call with their name and phone number from CISA and FBI on the incident response and on the law enforcement side.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think we have some time for questions, so I'm going to turn it back over to our organizer to get some questions to the panelists.
Hello, thank you. We have some great questions out here, and this has been a fantastic presentation to this point. The first question is related to risk mitigation as a holistic approach. And the question is, do we need a bigger cyber budget or a bigger enterprise risk mitigation budget? And the follow-up to that is, should risk oversight be moved to a risk officer as opposed to the district CIO? And is this an IT issue or a risk issue? There's a lot of questions in there. Let me know if you need me to break it down again.
I love that question. I'd be interested if Dave or Mark have any thoughts, and then I'd definitely toss my ideas in.
Yeah, I think from my perspective and the folks we've talked to, I would say it depends, because I think all of those are good solutions. But what's important is that you've thought out why you're putting those functions in specific places, clearly delineate roles and responsibilities. That's one of the huge things we look at when we're talking to these organizations, because more often than not, when something bad happens, it's because it wasn't clear who is supposed to do what, who's supposed to be managing what. So none of those are bad, but I think as long as there's intentionality and documentation about, we are going to do it this way, you've clearly said, person X, you do this, person Y, this is what you're responsible for, so that there aren't any holes for something to slip through.
I would. So when it comes to the first question, again, there are a few questions in there about, is it risk or security? I mean, obviously, the two are massively linked. If you try and put in place a ton of security without understanding your risk, then why are you doing it? And if you understand all of your risk but can't do anything about it with security, then what was the point in understanding your risk? Right. So it really is a balance between the two. So I think the question was, would you rather ask, which one would you ask for an increased budget in? And I think it would go back to an answer I would give to one question I gave earlier, is it depends where you are. Are you good in one and bad in another? Are you kind of okay in both? In which case, maybe we, rather than putting it all in one camp rather than the other, maybe we bump both up a little bit. But it has to be a balance between risk and security, so that you can say why I'm doing something with the risk side of things, and then the what I'm going to do with the security side of things.
Yeah, I think to build on that, most districts don't have anyone doing risk broadly, and most districts don't have anyone doing cyber broadly. And so I think If it's at the executive leadership level, I think to Dave's point, it's a governance question, right? So what are the controls we have in place, understanding what are the risks, and then how do we build our plan from those risks? And I think whether that means an increase in support for either the kind of executive office of the superintendent or for the IT folks, it's really a question of hashing out who owns which piece of this, because I think that that's the place where the real meaningful change happens, is in those conversations and in the fleshing out of that plan. And that's how we all get better.
Awesome. Marcella, I'll defer to you. Do you think we have time for one more, or would we call it final comments?
Yeah, I think we should hop to the conclusion. We have about 5 minutes left here. So I think it's clear that with all of the digital transformation that has occurred in the education sector, cybersecurity has to become a critical component of the education system. Some of the top items we can take away from this discussion is that school districts need to be preparing for attacks with tabletop exercises and having a response plan in place. Schools should be taking advantage of the free and low-cost resources available through organizations such as CISA and MSISAC. And lastly, it's important to understand the actual security risks and understand how to translate them into business terms to ensure that we're getting the right budget and resources and applying them in the most appropriate and effective manner. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists, and I'm going to turn it back over to Joyce.
Wow, this was an absolutely informative, educational, and inspiring session that we had today. I say inspiring because all is not lost. If you listen to these three experts and Marcella, you will definitely have a plan for moving forward with your school or school district. So first, I'd like to thank you again to our sponsor, Menlo. For additional information on future events, please go to our website, ICITECH.org. That's again, www.icitech.org. And note that within 24 hours, we will be posting this on our digital library so you can share it with others or review it yourself to get some additional information. Also, please note that our spring briefing is April 12th, 2023 at the Ritz-Carlton, Pentagon City. And you can acquire a hard or digital copy of our publication, Securing the Nation's Infrastructure, on Amazon. Catherine is putting that link in the chat, and that publication covers all 16 sectors, all 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and read the entire SLED chapter by Marcelo. Now, in final, how do you get involved with ICIT? You can become an individual member, a corporate member, or a thought leader partner. Thanks for your participation. Live long and prosper, and we will see you next time.